Welcome, everyone, to Book for Lunch at the Wilton Historical Society. We are pleased to present this program with the Wilton League of Women Voters. And Book for Lunch is a history-based book club that we hold 3 or 4 times a year at the Wilton Historical Society. We choose nonfiction books that generally often relate to women's topics or related to our exhibits and programming. For this choice, it is The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote by Elaine Weiss. And we chose this book several months ago as part of our ongoing celebration of the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, as you, I'm sure, are all aware. And during the year, we've already had a lecture. We're planning an exhibit to open this summer called Citizens at Last, Hannah Ambler, Grace Schenck, and the Vote. Of course, we had planned to have it in our main gallery. It is now going to be a virtual exhibit that will be available online, and we hope you will all visit it this summer. And then perhaps once we reopen, come to see us in person at the museum. The exhibit will contain items, photographs. We have a diary from Hannah Ambler that proudly proclaims that she had her first vote. And we will also include costumes from our costume collections and vignettes with period furniture and accoutrements of the time. So it's really going to be a nice exhibit. Virtually, and then hopefully in person, you can come and see it. We encourage you to do so. Given the current circumstances, we've obviously had to move our Book for Lunch meeting to Zoom, which we're happy to do. And luckily for us, the author of the book, Elaine Weiss, who under normal circumstances was fully booked with talking and speaking engagements about her book, suddenly her calendar became a lot more clear, and we were able to have her join us today, which we're really happy to include her in this. Elaine is joining us today from Baltimore, where she is an award-winning journalist and author. Her byline has appeared in many national publications, as well as in reports on NPR. We are so pleased to have her here with us to discuss the book. Because we have so many people joining us, we are going to limit the number of people who can actually speak so that we don't end up with a lot of background noise. I encourage you, as Elaine is speaking, to use the chat button on your Zoom screen to submit questions, which I will be reading as we go along, and then I can present them to Elaine. So without, let's see, I think I got everything about submitting questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Elaine, and now I'm going to spotlight you, Elaine. Let's see.
Yeah. Okay, there I am.
So,
hello, everyone.
I guess everyone wants to know why you wrote this book or how you came to writing this book.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. And I think it's one that everyone can relate to, which is that I realized that as an politically aware and politically active woman, you know, I work in campaigns, I vote in every election. I realized that I didn't know how I, as an American woman, had gotten the right to vote. I knew that at some point in our history, beginning with the Constitution, we did not have that right, and at some point we did. And I couldn't have told you the date. I couldn't have told you the circumstances. And I realized this was a big hole in my understanding of American history. And I'd written a book prior to this called Fruits of Victory, which actually involves Wilton. And it's about a group of American women in World War I who organized themselves to take care, to avert famine during the war, and organized something called the Women's Land Army. And in that organization, there are suffragists. So I had been introduced to the suffragists and the idea that they were working towards the federal amendment during the World War. But I realized that I didn't know much more than I had written about it. And I asked my friends, pretty well-educated people, and I'd say, well, do you know how American women won the vote? Do you know what the story is? And they look at me kind of hazy, hazy look in their eyes, and they'd say, well, Seneca Falls, with a question mark. And I realized, oh, no one knows this. And then I looked in our standard histories, and I studied American history. I don't remember learning much about it. If you ask most people, they'll say Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, as if they had done the entire movement themselves. And and the reason why is it's not taught very much, even at the college level. I hope that will change. But a lot of people come up to me and said, I was a American history major. I was a women's studies major. I didn't know very much. I know a little. And again, when you look at our standard school textbooks, you'll see things, you'll see this entire movement, this pivotal milestone civil rights movement that goes on for 7 decades. You'll see it dismissed in a sentence or 2 sentences or maybe a paragraph. And it'll say something like, in 1848, American women demanded the vote at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And then in 1920, they were given the vote. And that's it. As if it was magic, great men saw the light, and this was, bestowed upon American women, and they had nothing to do with it. And that's not how it was. And so I realized this was a very important story, and we knew very little about it. And it was so much a story about democracy, about how change is made in society, about women's rights, and all of these themes and issues and power dynamics we're still dealing with. We're still grappling with a lot of the questions that the suffragists were having to grapple with a century and a half ago, a century ago. And so I wanted to write about this, but I am a narrative historian. I didn't want to do a textbook. I wanted to make this very readable, very engaging. I wanted to make the women involved, the women leaders at not just the national level, and of course there are national leaders who are prominent in the book, but I wanted to make the second echelon, the lieutenants, the leaders at the state and local levels, show what they had to go through and how important they were. And so I wanted to take a different approach to how suffrage, if it is written about, and it's not very much, and certainly not in a popular book. So I wanted to write a popular book. I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to have a narrative, and I wanted it to have characters who you could invest emotional energy in, because often women in history are portrayed as stick figures, cartoon figures, one-dimensional. And I wanted you to see these women as complex, as political activists, as politicians themselves. I wanted you to see their motivations. Why would they do this? Why would many of them devote their lives to this cause? What were the sacrifices they made? What are their talents, their foibles, their moral compromises, their vanities? I wanted you to understand them as full people. And so that entailed a lot of primary research, which I think we'll get into, but that's why I wanted to write this story. And when I discovered in the preliminary research, um, the story of Tennessee, the story of the last state to ratify, to put the 19th Amendment into the Constitution, and the drama of the story, it really gets wild. I realized I had the makings of a book that could tell a very dramatic and fast-paced front story. But then because of the people who were involved there, because of the characters who are involved in that fight in Nashville in the summer of 1920, I could pull back the lens and tell the whole story. Tell the story of how they got to Nashville, why it came to Tennessee, what was the movement like from the beginning, what were the historical forces, the philosophical forces, and give you a grounding in what the suffrage movement meant. And I was very fortunate to find that story and to be able to have the primary resources to tell it. So that's why I wrote it. And one of the things I greatly enjoy as I tour around the country speaking to people, or my readers write to me, is they'll say, I never knew this. How come I never knew this? And so that I think it fills a need that we should be more aware and understand this, because it helps us understand things that are going on today.
Well, you certainly do bring these characters to life. Carrie Cat was in my head while I was reading it all the time, and when I wasn't reading it. Where did you find all the information about so many of these foot soldiers, down to the details of who went to whose home in which county and how they got there? And it was just so richly detailed. It's hard for me to imagine that it was all so well documented, but obviously it was.
Well, it was. And again, sometimes I hear from my readers, and I got a note like this yesterday, said, I just loved your novel. And the dialogue in your novel. And I always respond and say, well, I'm gratified. I take it as a compliment. If you think it reads like a novel, then I've done what I set out to do, which was to make an enjoyable read. However, it's not a novel. It is not fiction. It is, you don't have to look in the back, but there are 750 endnotes, and every single citation, every quotation is cited as to a source. So how did I get all this information? And I'm, again, very lucky that a lot of this material was just kept. I found it, my first research foray was to Nashville and to the state archives, where they kept, bless their hearts, every single little scrap of paper that was produced by the suffragists and even the anti-suffragists during that 6-week period, and a little before and a little after. And it's on microfilm. So I had to scroll through lots and lots of microfilm, but they had it all. And they had memos, they had telegrams, they had marginalia, you know, with they scribbled in the edges. They had letters that passed between the women. And that was so valuable. I actually bought the microfilm. I know that doesn't excite most people, but it really excited me. I could buy microfilm, bring it home, and go to my local university and spend many hours in a windowless, airless room going through the microfilm. But it gave me enormous detail. That was supplemented by the collections in the Library of Congress of both of the major suffrage organizations, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is Carrie Katz, and then the National Women's Party, which is Alice Paul's. And both of those played very major roles in Tennessee. And so there I had the correspondence, the reports that the field organizers in Tennessee were sending back to Alice Paul or sending to one another. And so there is where I could see where they went, They traveled from here to here. They went to speak to this person or that person. They would make caustic comments about them. He's fat and oily and really makes my skin crawl. I mean, that was some of the comments when they went to meet some of these politicians. And so I had that. And then that was supplemented with personal papers that I could find in various archives. The Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard has wonderful, wonderful personal papers as well as institutional papers of the suffragists. And that was very, very valuable. So I had letters, I had reminiscences from their colleagues. That gave me a lot of detail. There was unpublished memoirs in small state university in Pennsylvania. And I went up there and read that. And then there were newspaper accounts of everything going on. And those were very, very detailed. They had great quotations. They had, they took you behind the scenes of things that might have been said in the legislature. And then there were also the legislative, the sort of congressional record of the Tennessee legislature. So all of those were really valuable to me. And then that was supplemented by my ability to go to Nashville and see these places. And that first trip there was in mid-August, which is when many of these events take place. It's in the summer of 1920. And so I went there in the summer of 1913. Pardon me, 2013.
Oh, you are.
I get in such trouble. I have had checks returned to me because I write 1920. So you kind of live in your period. But I went there in the summer to feel the heat. I wanted to feel the heat. And I knew that the heat was almost a character because everyone complained about the heat that summer. They all write letters saying, I can't stand this. And it was an especially hot summer, at least part of it. And so as I'm there, as a modern woman, able to escape to air conditioning where they were not, I realized how much that must have affected people's moods because you're hot, it's very humid, it's pressing on you. And of course, these women are wearing 10 pounds of clothes. They're not wearing little sundresses. They're wearing long dresses and long sleeves, heavy material. And they're having to go, walk up and down stairs and up to the visitors gallery in the State House. And I wanted to feel that. I wanted to understand it. It's almost like method acting for writers. I wanted to feel it. And I certainly did. And that gave me a sense of what it was like. But the other very fortunate thing is that the places that I write about there, the State House looks very much as it did. They've spiffed up the chambers a bit, but it, physically it looks the same. It's very much the same. I could walk through there and see where these debates took place. I could go to Union Station, where everybody kind of comes and goes, and it becomes a focal point. And that has been restored. It's no longer a train station, but it's a really fancy hotel. But they kept everything. So I could see those angels of commerce that I described at the beginning. I could see where these people would be when they were arriving and leaving surreptitiously from Nashville. And then the hotel, the Hermitage Hotel, which is the location of so much of the action. It's just 2 blocks from the State House. It's where everyone was staying. Both wings of the suffrage movement, who did not work together, but worked through separate headquarters and separate staffs. The anti-suffragists are there. The legislators are there. The lobbyists are there. And so everyone is, meeting in the hallways. There are fist fights. There's spies going around listening through the transoms. And the hotel is beautifully restored. And I could describe it in a detail I never could just from photographs. And Hermitage has really been great stewards of the story. They now have, it's a wonderful, wonderful 5-star hotel. It has a whole section of the lobby now that's dedicated to telling this story. They've been very proud of it, very much part of Tennessee's celebration of this history. And at one point, I didn't stay there when I was doing the research, but subsequently I've stayed there, and they give me what was Carrie Katz's room.
Oh.
So yeah, and the first time I walked in, I wasn't paying attention. They gave me a room on the 3rd floor, okay, and I walk in, and I realized, because the view is the view she described, and it's a view of the State House looming in the window. You feel like you can almost touch it. And I realized this is her room. So that was very, very meaningful to me. So that all these places still exist. And that enhanced my ability to describe them in detail and in a kind of tangible way. But mostly it's the letters and the notations and the memos of the women themselves. And thankfully that has been retained. And I shudder to think of historians of our period, historians who are going to write about what we go through right now, because a lot of that material is ephemeral and digital, and I don't know what they're going to work with. So I'm very glad I had, the fusty old paper records of the early 19th century.
Were you able to find as much on the aunties? I mean, I'm sure most of us we view them through our modern lens and can't believe, any woman wouldn't want to vote. However, it was a different time, of course. Were they as well documented?
No, they're not as well documented. And I did try, and I think I did not do as much in that. There are some fine books that go into more detail about the anti-suffragists, but they play a large role in my story, and I documented that part of it and went back. Someone like Charlotte Rao, who's this fascinating national organizer for the women opposed to suffrage, and she is a political operative. She goes from one campaign to the next. She's very articulate. She has a very sharp tongue. She always wants to debate the suffragists because she's really good at that, and they don't want to go anywhere near her because she says outrageous things, but in a very convincing way. And so I did as much as I could, but I realized there was very little I could dig out than I did. There are publications. I did go to the New York Public Library, where they have some records of the anti-suffragists and the men who were involved in the anti-suffrage movement. And the Boston Public Library and the Massachusetts Historical Society does have a big collection of that. I was not able to go there personally for that because it was just a little beyond my scope. But there are excellent scholarly articles about that, and there have been some exhibits. So the anti-suffragists, I think, are the most fascinating because, again, I fully admit that I knew nothing about them. It was shocking to me to encounter them at first in my research and find that there were organized groups of women who are actively working against women's suffrage, both in the States and then in Congress, and then back in the States when it's time for ratification. And what their rationale was, and there were different, not everyone has the same rationales. And I do try to bring those in and highlight some of those women who are working against suffrage and try to understand. I mean, it was interesting because in some ways, their fears came to pass. So they were not outrageous fears. They're saying if women can vote, they may feel they're equal, and they may want to work outside the home. They may want careers of their own. They may want to abandon their families, which of course we still hear about. Working women are abandoning their families. So some of this I read and said, I've heard this before. I've heard this in my lifetime. This argument is not dead. And then some are just social conservatives who truly believe this is going to upend gender roles in the American family. It's going to destroy morality. It's going to destroy the American family. And of course, we've heard those arguments too, whether it comes through in marriage equality arguments or other social concerns. So the arguments they made, as sort of outrageous as we may think them, are really still with us. And that was an interesting insight that I came to slowly as I was writing about them. And I also realized that some of these women were made some outrageous arguments and self-contradictory and hypocritical in many ways. And it would have been easy to make fun of them. And I think at first I was having a lot of fun quoting them and making them seem as silly as they possibly could. And then I realized, and my husband was very good about explaining, arguing with me and saying, no, they were worthy opponents. You have to make their arguments as strong as they saw them to be, because they did convince some people. So I tried to present their arguments in both historical context and the political moment at the time. And some of them do still come off as hypocritical, but I think it was important to explain them, because it was a countervailing force, and we still live with that. I mean, I'm often asked about what happened in the last presidential election and how some majority of white women could vote in what some of us would say was against their best interests. And I think studying the anti-suffragists teaches us some lessons and shows us some historical parallels. Mm-hmm. And I do understand that there's a kind of fascinating TV series on now about Phyllis Schlafly. I haven't gotten to see it, but Phyllis Schlafly comes out of the evolution of the anti-suffrage movement. And in the last chapter of the book, in the afterword, I kind of trace this line. So it really is fascinating. She definitely gets trained in the organizations that grow out of the anti-suffrage movement.
Mm-hmm. In fact, so I'm seeing quite a few comments on the chat, and just before you said that, someone said that the anti-movement is portrayed in Mrs. America on Netflix and continues today in ERA opposition. Mm-hmm. And so I have a few questions too, unless you want to comment on that.
Sure. Well, no, it's absolutely true. And basically what happens after 1920 is the suffragists disperse. The suffrage movement was a big tent. It had Republican women, Democratic women, socialists. It had conservative and liberal, or progressive. It was this huge tent of people, of women and men who had different political approaches and attitudes and interests, but it brought them together in one cause. So once that cause is, for the most part, realized, though of course we know the limitations is undermined, but once that is achieved, the movement the tent folds, and women especially go out and pursue their own interests. And some of that's in the political parties, and some of that is in social betterment organizations, and some of that is in the League of Women Voters. And so, women go to to their spheres of interest. What happens to the anti-suffragists is really interesting in that they actually become more powerful. They, for the most part, get over their aversion to voting and say, okay, you forced us to vote. We're going to use that vote to propel our own agenda. And many of these women are social and political conservatives, some religious conservatives. And they're going to then coalesce and use the power of their vote to, and their lobbying agility, to work against certain measures in Congress, for instance, that they think are socialist, like maternal welfare, child and maternal welfare. They say this is government overreach. This is socialism. And we hear that that kind of anti-communist refrain even in Nashville. If you'll recall, the suffragists are called Bolsheviks. They call Carrie Catt a Bolshevik. That continues. That even long after the 19th Amendment, they still accuse Carrie Catt and Jane Addams of being internationalists. So all this kind of rings very familiar right now. And they still go after them and accuse them of being communists. And a lot of the anti-suffragists then join organizations that are anti-communist. And then we see them in the McCarthy era. And then we see them evolving into opposing the ERA. And we see them in, the Eagle Forum still exists. It is run by Phyllis Schlafly's daughter. Oh. So yeah, it's that whole history afterwards is very, very interesting.
Well, that brings me to one question that was submitted, which is, were you able to talk with any of the descendants of the main characters?
Yes, I was. Not lots. And what's been kind of thrilling is since the book's come out, I've met more. Oh. But I did my darndest to track down who I could. And so I spoke to a nephew of Joe Hanover, who's one of the characters, the heroes in Nashville in the legislature. And they, they were able, they knew Uncle Joe when he was older, and he used to tell the story of what happened. So I had some of that. I was able to find a few other descendants and get some, insights into the characters. So it was like little color bits. And that was a thrill. A woman in Massachusetts had just given her grandmother's papers to the Schlesinger Library, and they weren't processed yet. They were still in boxes. Oh, and I tracked it down, and I went up there, and she took me through it, just personal tour through the boxes. And that was really a thrill. And that gave me, she was participating in the action in Nashville, and that gave me a whole another way to describe what was going on. So yeah, it was really great. And then since then, I as I said, I've met Carrie Catt's great great nephew, and I've met a descendant of Anita Politzer and Catherine Flanagan, and people do write to me. So that's been really fun.
That is nice. Here's another question. In our current pandemic context, I've been thinking a lot about the additional risks and complications that the Spanish flu posed for the suffragists a century ago. How much did this theme emerge in your research?
Well, that's a really interesting question. In my research, again, I'm concentrating on 1920, on the ratification. And in the fall, the influenza pandemic really comes to America in 1918, and especially with the returning troops from World War I. And so I think I mention it. It was, there's even, and it continues, I hate to say it, but there are subsequent waves. And so I know I write about one woman in the Midwest who is a suffragist and is trying to get the amendment ratified in her state legislature, and she's supposed to debate someone in the legislature who is against ratification. And she has the influenza and she's quite sick, but she insists against her doctor's orders to go up and debate this guy. And she does, and she's brilliant, and she goes home and she dies. So the legislature actually does ratify and says they do it in her memory. So I do write about that, but it was not a big part of my research. Now, of course, I was not expecting that we'd be going through something like this. And so just yesterday, actually, and I can send the link to you, Kim, and you can distribute it, but I helped a New York Times reporter write about the effect of the pandemic on the suffrage campaign. And so what's going on in October, which is really the height of it, October of 1918 is the height in America, and that's just before an election. And so the suffragists were very active that spring and summer in several campaigns. First, there are 4 state referenda about suffrage. And if you, again, I talk about this in the book, there's 2 ways to get suffrage. Either the states are in charge of qualifications for their citizens to vote. We know we're still going through that. There are states who are being very difficult about allowing people to vote. It's called voter suppression, and we're living with that today. But that was true then too, and there were states where the suffragists fought and fought and fought to have it put on the ballot to change the state constitution, which normally prohibited women from voting. And so there were 4 of these in the fall of 1918 occurring across the country. And so they have suffragists who are campaigning for that, and suddenly in the late summer and fall, they have to stop because there are social distancing requirements and mandates, and there's no big gatherings. And so those rallies, those conventions, all the suffrage state conventions and national conventions are canceled in 1918 and 19. And so the campaigning had to go on, but they did it by mail, and they did it by taking advertisements in the newspaper. There's no radio yet. There's no real mass media except for newspapers. And so they're mailing suffrage brochures to the male voters, because remember, it's only the men in these states who can vote to decide whether women deserve to vote. So they kept at it, but they weren't able to do their usual campaigning. The other thing they're campaigning for is in the Congress, because a new Congress is being elected, and the 19th Amendment in October of 18 is still stuck in Congress. It has still not been passed by Congress. It's been almost 40 years since it was introduced in 1878. And so they are trying to flip the Senate. They're trying to get some anti-suffrage senators who've been a wall between getting getting passage of the 19th Amendment before it can go to the states for ratification. 2/3 of both the House and the Senate has to pass it. And there were a band of very stubborn senators who refused to let it pass. It had passed in the House by then, had not in the Senate. And so they're trying to flip some seats. And so the women are out there campaigning to get rid of some of these anti-suffrage senators. And that has to stop, because the campaigning has to be curtailed, just as it is right now. So they had to deal with all that. And so I did a little research in helping the reporter, and found a really fascinating little tidbit, which was that there's a famous photograph of Carrie Chapman Catt voting for the first time in 1918. Now, how did she get to vote before the 19th Amendment? Because there were states, especially in the West, where women were given the vote by their states, by this popular referendum changing the constitution of the state. In New York, there had been a referendum in 1915, which failed. By the way, that was a referendum which took place in fall of 1915 in both New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, and they failed in all states. The northeastern states were really the worst. It was very conservative there. Connecticut never even tried. You never had a referendum because it wasn't going to pass. So in 1917, New York tried again, and they did win. And so New York state women could vote beginning in 1918. And so Carrie Catt can vote for the first time in her life, and she's sick in bed with the influenza. And her doctor says, "You shouldn't go out, Carrie." And she says, "There's no way I am not going to vote in the first election where I can." So she drags herself out, and there's a famous photograph of her and her partner Molly Hay voting in New York. And I never realized, and someone describes her as, looking very pale and wan. And I looked at that photo again and I blew it up and I said, yeah, she's got, bags under her eyes. So she was really sick, but she was not, she wasn't wearing a mask, which is kind of disturbing. But so I was fascinated with how the suffragists kept going. And basically to pull it together, they had to keep going. They were, limited in what they could do. They couldn't do the rallies and the marches and the parades and the street corner speeches that they were really, really good at, and really got men kind of excited about it and changed some minds. They had to be more restrained, but they figured out ways to do it. And in fact, they kind of persevered. So there was an effect, but again, another instance of their amazing persistence and ingenuity.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak to the split among the suffragists? Kat and Paul created a dissonance within the movement. How much of an impact do you think this created? Did this create the delays and problems for the 19th Amendment voting process?
Yes. Well, this is, it's a fascinating portrait of a split in a social reform movement, in a civil rights movement. And one of the things we should understand is that this happens in almost all movements, especially ones that have had to go on for a long time. At the point where Alice Paul splits off on a disagreement of strategy and tactics, not goal. They're all on the same page for the goal, but on strategy and tactics. The movement's been going on for almost 70 years, and there's not been a whole lot to show for it, though there are states by that time, about I forget at the point in 1913 when the split begins, but probably 7 or 8 states where women can vote. Now, they're not big population states yet, but they are beginning. California, for instance, 1911 can vote, but California wasn't as populous as New York or Illinois, and those come along later. So this had already happened. This kind of split had already happened in the British suffrage movement, which, again, very parallel. They worked very closely together. The leaders knew each other. Alice Paul trains, she learns these radical tactics by being a volunteer in Great Britain with the Pankhursts, who led the more radical, called the militant wing of the suffrage movement there. So she brings these tactics back, and she says, we're not waiting anymore. We're not going to be polite. We're going to be confrontational. So there is a split, but that split had happened already in the UK. There's a more traditional, they call themselves the constitutionalists, the equivalent of Carrie Catt. And Carrie Catt and Millicent Fawcett, the head of that group, are very close. It's mirrored in what has already happened in the UK. And when you look back, the same thing happened in the abolition movement, where John Brown goes off and says, okay, we're going to have to be radical. We're going to have to be violent about this. We're not getting anywhere with just words. You see it happen in the labor movement. The Wobblies decide, again, we're going to take a different tactics. The civil rights movement later in the 20th century certainly goes through that kind of split of militancy or not. The gay rights movement does. The animal rights movement does. So it's sort of a natural evolutionary phase. So we shouldn't think that it was only the suffragists who couldn't get along. It was not that way. There were legitimate arguments. Historians still debate whether the split in the American movement slowed things down because they couldn't work together, and there was actually a lot of animosity between the two groups. And I was sort of disappointed to see how it played out even on the personal level, and I document some of that in the book. But it also the other argument, is that it sped things along, because you had these sort of good cop, bad cop. You had the group that tried to woo Woodrow Wilson to support the 19th Amendment, and the ones who were picketing and calling him Kaiser Wilson. And so I think most historians agree that it took both. It took both to coalesce, to have the tension and friction, and to propel it. It made it messy and ugly, because there was this, very obvious split, but in the long run, it probably helped. I think that's the consensus.
Okay. Someone probably several people in this group have not read the book, and one person has asked if you could give a quick summary, a synopsis of the suffrage movement. I know that's a big ask, but just a quick overview.
Well, it's sort of, American history and in a nutshell. Okay, I'll try to be very brief. The idea of women having equal rights, actually, in an women are talking about this forever. This is not new. It doesn't just pop up at Seneca Falls as a unique moment. It's been talked about, it's been debated. Famously, Abigail Adams writes to her husband John at the Constitutional Conventions that don't remember the ladies, remember that women should have a place in this new democracy. And yet, through the first 150 years of our democracy, women have no voice. They have they don't have the most basic right of citizenship, which is the vote. And so when you think of it, how did we even call ourselves a democracy when more than half, because of course, Black people are not allowed to vote either, men either. How do we call ourselves a democracy? And yet we have this self-image as a democracy. And I think that question is still valid today. But anyway, so women are talking about this amongst themselves. But in 1848, the first organized women's rights convention, sort of out there, public, is organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Why in Seneca Falls? Because she was living there. And I explain how this happens and how that Declaration of Sentiments is designed. And again, one of the wonderful, surprising moments is to find that Frederick Douglass is in the audience in the Wesley Chapel in Seneca Falls. He has been working with Stanton and Lucretia Mott and the other organizers in the abolition movement, because the suffrage movement, the women's rights movement, actually comes out of the abolition movement. It is both a daughter and a sibling. The idea of all humans having the right of citizenship, the right of personhood. They cannot be owned, they cannot be traded, they cannot be denied their rights. And so the women we know as foremothers of the suffrage movement actually begin their political careers as abolition organizers. Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton are out there, and certainly Lucy Stone are out there organizing and risking their lives in the abolition movement. And they have a lot of allies like Frederick Douglass who see the connection between the rights of slaves and emancipation, and then further voting rights and women's rights. And so they work together for decades. And it's after the Civil War, and I'm not going to get into this, but there's a split over the 14th and 15th Amendment, which they were promised, they assumed and were led to believe that after the Civil War, universal suffrage would be enacted. So Black men, Black women, white women, would all the disenfranchised classes would get the vote. And that doesn't happen. They're told the nation can't handle two great reforms at once, can't focus on two reforms at once, and the woman's hour will have to wait. And that's where the title of my book comes from. It is not the woman's hour will have to wait. And they have to wait another 50 years. And so then you see gradual organization in the states and then at national level. And race remains an issue, a divisive issue. And, that's explained a lot in the book. And then it finally gets through Congress. World War I propels it in many ways. And finally, after, you're going to hear a phone ring, and I'm not going to answer it. After 40 years in Congress, it finally gets passed and then has to go to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify. And that's where my story is told, and especially what happens in Tennessee. And the fact that I think the sobering and exciting part is that it almost doesn't pass. It's very close to defeat. And I think that's something we should realize. It was not inevitable, not at all.
Now, following up on that, what you just said, we have a question that says, your last chapter struck a chord. Can you comment on how you see the future? So basically talking about the suspense and all the issues that went into that.
Well, I just want to clarify, because the last chapter is not just the vote in Tennessee. So I just want to get a little clear. What are we talking about in the very last chapter? The afterward, I'm talking about voting rights today and what happened to the movements. So is that where we're going, or is it?
I think that's what she's going for.
Pardon?
The current situation.
I'm not sure I heard. I just want to clarify.
It seems that you're breaking up just
okay.
But.
I think it's we're having a storm. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So where we are now, well, I handed in the manuscript book in day 2016. Timing was that's when it was due. It was due beginning of November, and I handed it in. I have to say that I wrote with the expectation, at least in the last year of the writing, that this would be published in the first term of the first woman president. And of course, that would put, it was sort of the crowning glory of this story. And I handed it in, and my editor wrote back, "Great timing." And of course, 24 hours later, the situation had changed. So what she told me when we regained consciousness was, you know, this story is really more important now. And I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I was kind of too distraught. And she said, it really is, because we're going to be dealing with these themes, even in an even more immediate way. And so, you know, again, some weeks later, there's a women's march, and women are wearing pink pussy hats in protest to what they fear will be an assault on their and the nation's rights. They were not wrong. But here I've just written about women marching en masse at a time when it was not considered appropriate for women to express political opinions in public like that. And here are 1 million women marching on Washington and marching all over the world, in every city and every town. And I thought, oh my goodness, this has reverberations. I've just written about these marches. They, you know, they weren't necessarily wearing white with suffrage sashes, but here they are. And in fact, at the march in Washington, which I did attend with my daughter and son, that there were people who held up suffrage posters and suffrage iconography. And I thought, wow, the past is present. And of course, since then, many of the themes that I write about seem like they're ripped from the headlines of today. And whether that's voter suppression and voting rights, very, very important and topical and in dispute right now. Women's rights, the role of dark money in politics. We know that there was corporate funding of the anti-suffragists, and we certainly see that today. The role of religion in promulgating public policy, and racism. And so all of these really important themes are now are the stuff of our news every day. And so I can't tackle all of them, but I have made it my mission as I go around the country. I have the great privilege of being invited to many, many places around the country. I think I was supposed to be in Montana right now. And I, at the end, after I talk about the suffrage history, I try to bring it into the present. And wherever I go, I look on a website that is run by NYU Law School. It's called the Brennan Center for Justice. And they do a really good job of tracking what kind of legal restrictions are being placed in the different states. And so I kind of do a little research on what's happening in the state where I'm going to be appearing. And I kind of bring it home and say, all right, you know, we're going to celebrate this great moment when your state ratified the 19th Amendment, and rah, rah, and I'm with you and I want to celebrate it. But I think you have to realize in those states where it applies that your state, in that same state house where you ratified, you are slashing voting rights today. You are undermining democracy, and that hypocrisy has to be recognized and dealt with. And we can't celebrate this, we can't commemorate it without realizing we're still dealing with an urge and in some cases successfully to curb democracy, to curb every citizen having a voice. So I try to make that part really relevant and and explain that you, my audience, and whether that's the League of Women Voters who are doing such a great, they are such champions of voting rights in every state and at the national level, and they are bringing these issues to court. They are suing the legislatures who have these onerous voter ID or suppression tactics. They're educating. I say hello from my home league in Baltimore City, but I think we have to realize that we have to stand up like the suffragists did and said, no, this is not acceptable. So I'm trying to bring that part of the story into the current environment, and certainly, watching what happened in Wisconsin a week or so ago, and the kind of tactics that are being planned around the country. I think we need to be aware, we need to be vocal, and I want to bring the history of it to bear. But I think as citizens today, our responsibility, the suffragists worked to get women, half of the nation, the right to vote. The civil rights activists in the mid-century worked to assure that the 15th and the 19th Amendment were enforced, and to bring the vote finally to Black voters Black citizens in the southern states who'd been denied it, not by the 19th Amendment, not by the 15th Amendment, but by the subversion of those amendments by racist Jim Crow laws. And our responsibility today, our generation and the generation following us, is to protect the vote for all citizens. That is our job. That is the way we need to both honor what the suffragists did and expand it. So there are lessons to be learned. Suffragists were not perfect. They didn't do everything right. They didn't make all the right decisions. But studying how they did it and under what circumstances, and how they built coalitions or not, I think is very valuable.
Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. There are a few other questions, but I don't want to take all your time.
Well, we can, if you want to do a few more, that's fine.
There was one about the role of the Electoral College and how it fits into the idea of the vote for all.
Yeah, it's certainly an issue in electoral politics. It's not one I am as versed in, and I'm going to probably pass on that.
Okay.
Certainly, it is again part of the structure of our government that was to how should we say, it could be said to equalize power, but it actually is not. It's to deny power to populous states. So I'm going to pass on that one, but it's certainly part of our electoral terrain that we should be grappling with.
Okay. How about, could you talk a bit about race and Southern and national politics in the final push and within women's suffrage?
That's a really big.
That's a big question.
That's pretty much the whole book.
Well, yeah.
Because I do deal with the racial aspects at every turn, and I think forthrightly, and I've been gratified that readers have seen it as not pulling any punches, but I think I'm not going to answer that in depth because there's too much detail to go into. Race plays a huge part in this, as it plays a part in all parts of our American history. You can't point to a movement or an epic where race isn't involved. And it certainly is in the suffrage movement. And are there racist suffragists? Of course. This involved millions and millions of people. Is the movement itself, is it its intention to be racist? I don't believe so. I think there are instances where we see it, but it's not its prime concern. the 19th Amendment promises the right to vote to all women. Now remember, no one in our Constitution affirmatively has the right to vote. No one is guaranteed the right to vote. If you look at our voting amendments, they are all the classes of citizens who cannot be denied. 15th Amendment says the vote shall not be denied by the federal government or the states to those who under previous servitude, basically Black citizens, but male citizens, only male citizens covered in the 15th Amendment. 19th Amendment says on the basis of sex, but it's shall not be denied. It never says all American citizens have the right to vote. So that's a very interesting legal, constitutional situation. And there are historians and legal scholars who are saying, you know, maybe we need an amendment that affirmatively says that American citizens over 18 have the right to vote, rather than just who can't be denied. So, you know, it's an interesting double negative kind of situation. But race is not one thing that does disturb me, and I see this a lot in the current discussion of the 19th Amendment and the centennial, is the idea that this is only a commemoration for white women, because only white women were given the vote. And in some cases, I've seen this in the press where it says the 19th Amendment only gave white women the vote. And that is just not true. The 19th Amendment gives all women the vote. How is it subverted? How does that promise not come to pass for Black women in the South? Remember, Black women in the North, in the Midwest, in the West can vote. But how is that undermined? It's undermined by racist state legislatures in the South who impose Jim Crow laws, and that involves literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, lynching, violence. It's not the 19th Amendment, it's the subversion of the 19th Amendment that causes that. It's also the fault of Congress. Congress, the second part of the 19th Amendment says, and Congress shall have the power to enforce this, and they never do. They never do when Black women cannot be registered to vote and are intimidated if they try, just as Black men are. And it takes the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to give the legal tools to go after these kinds of suppression tactics. And now, of course, major enforcement part, Section 5 of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, has been gutted by the Supreme Court in Holder versus Shelby County in 2013. And that means that that's when we see a lot of blossoming, shall we say, of these voter restriction laws in the states, because there's no longer that enforcement tool. So we've gone backwards in lots of ways in terms of voter rights, and a lot of that is racially based. So race plays a big part. It's something we need to look at and see where the suffragists failed, and certainly they did fail in lots of ways. But there are also, we have to understand the context in which it happened, and the kind of pressures, and mostly I also want to bring attention to the way race was weaponized by the anti-suffragists. They're the ones who truly use race as a cudgel. So it's complicated. It's not simple. It's not black and white. And I think we need to understand it in that complicated fashion. Now, one of the things that the centennial, one of the great accomplishments, I think, of the centennial, of this idea of looking at suffrage history. Just as Wilton, as the Historical Society, is going to celebrate it with more research, putting on an exhibit, talks. It's bringing in new voices. It's stimulating new research at the local level. And that's bringing in white women and Black women and Hispanic women and Native American women who were involved at the local levels, who were so important to the movement, but their voices have not been part of the big narrative, partly because they're harder to find. They're not in the history of women's suffrage. They're not in the Library of Congress necessarily. They're in the local historical societies. They're in the church records. They're in the women's club records. So they're harder to ferret out. And one of the things that's so great is that they're being ferreted out now. And people are looking in their attics, which is great. There's probably stuff there that's going to inform, that's going to bring new women into this narrative. And I think what we see, and there's some great scholarship and there's some great popular work being done about these different voices and these different groups who are working, who may not have been in the spotlight at the time, but really deserve a lot of credit. So that's a really exciting part for me, is to complicate the story, enrich it with these voices of minority women who are working so hard to bring democracy to their community.
Well, this has been so interesting to all of us, and I encourage everyone to read the book. And if you're going to buy it, we suggest you buy it through bookshop.org, which gives some of their proceeds to local booksellers, which, as we know, are always struggling and looking for to stay afloat, or to go to. Some of the booksellers in our area are doing curbside pickup. Elaine, we had one question, which was your future book talks, or Zoom dates. Are there any that are available to our public here who might like to join you? Is there somewhere that you have them listed? Do you have a website? Or?
Yes, I do. It's ElaineWeiss.com, really easy. And it normally, and in fact, it still has all of my upcoming appearances, but to tell you the truth, I haven't had the heart to change it and say cancel. Some of them have been converted into virtual, and I'll be doing some Zoom talks, formal talks. Some of them have been pushed to the fall, to the winter, to next spring or summer. So I'd say the best way of keeping up, but maybe not right now, is to look at the website. I am, as I think I was telling Kim before we went on, I'm scheduled to be at the Chautauqua in New York State on August 1st. Hope that happens. And again, around the country, I was to be at Ridgefield Library in Connecticut, and that will need to be rescheduled. So I'm looking forward to being able to be back on the road. I love doing it. It's just great fun and really important, because I get to talk to my readers. But you can email me through the website. There's a way of doing that. You could ask questions. I should say that the book is being published as a young readers edition, a kind of simplified version of the story that's coming out from Random House Children's. I think it's June 2nd is the pub date, and it is again called The Woman's Hour. And there's some illustrations and some photographs. So if you have young readers in your orbit who you think will find this inspiring, and it is an inspiring story, there will be that version of it soon.
And the TV version, when is that due to hit?
Well, I don't know a date. It's still in development. It's still chugging along, slower than any of us thought.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I don't have any dates, but it is still kind of moving along.
Wonderful. Well, on behalf of the Wilton Historical Society and the Wilton League of Women Voters, we thank you so much for giving us your time today. And your book was a fabulous read, and I encourage everyone to encourage their friends and family to read it also.
Yeah, it's a great book club book too, as you can see,
Really
because there's just a lot to discuss. And in the paperback version, there is a reader's guide of questions that my editor and I constructed. So I know it's a really popular book club book. So
yeah. So thank you, and don't be a stranger when you're in Ridgefield.
thank you. I hope I can come
in
visit.
Wilton. Hopefully we'll be back by August 1st, but who knows?
Yes.
Or well, no, that's not when you're doing that one. You haven't rescheduled the Ridgefield yet.
Right. Haven't done that yet. Anyway, thank you very much. Wish I could be with you in person.
But we had more people come this way than we ever had for our book for lunch. So we hope we've created some converts. We're going to add everyone to our mailing list to be sure.
Great. Okay.
Thanks,
everyone. Okay.
Bye-bye. Isn't too bad.
I'm staying inside.
Oh, good. Okay. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.